When did you move into this beautiful factory?
This would be 20 years, probably around 2004.
Wow.
You know, I was driving around with my daughter, actually. I take her with the car. We're learning to parallel park and do K-turns and U-turns and all kinds of fun stuff. And there's a sign on the building. So I write the number down or take a picture of it with my phone. And I get home, and my wife at the time was on the computer looking for more space because we outgrew 1,500 square feet. We outgrew it in 6 months. We were literally sitting on top of combos building amps.
Wow.
You walked in and you went, well, this is a good space. And then all of a sudden, 6 months later, it's like, holy shit, I got no room to tape up boxes and ship them. And it got big quick. And I called up on that Monday, and the woman answers the phone, and she's like, oh, that sign's still up? She goes, that space has been empty 10 years.
Wow.
I'm like, wow. And the landlord, God bless him, he's a great guy. We've got a fair deal for the amount of room we have. He said the building is zoned for manufacturing. It's set up for manufacturing. That's what I want in here. And I'm like, well, then I'm your guy.
Wow. And I know you welcome people to come and try out the equipment here in the showroom. Do you do sales out of here as well?
We do. We've got a website, Fuchs Audio Direct. You know, and there are people that like to buy from the manufacturer rather than through a dealer or a distributor. They like that personal attention. If they want a custom color or they want the amp to be tweaked, hey, can I get it brighter or more bass or more reverb or whatever, we also offer that service.
Oh wow. Who inspired your amps the most? Like say Dumble or Trainwreck or Fender?
Along the way we've done a little bit of everything. Like the Clean Machine amp was described at, I did an amp show years ago in LA. And Carl Verheyen, who's a very famous studio guitar player, he played with Supertramp for a while, and he's on a ton of sessions. He played our Clean Machine, and he said, this is the Fender Twin that Fender never made.
Wow.
He said, it sounds like the biggest, hugest Fender Twin I've ever played. It's just majestic.
Wow.
So that pathway is sort of a Fender-inspired thing. The overdrive amps are definitely in the Dumble camp. I started out, a good buddy of mine sold me a Fender Bandmaster for like $100 and a 6-pack of beer, and I gutted it and I built it a letter perfect Dumble clone in it. I got schematics off the internet. I've serviced a few of them and made notes. So I built one, and I liked it a lot, but I said there's an opportunity to make things bigger and better here. So I added reverb, and I added an effects loop, and I added various boosts and switches and things that Dumble didn't do. And for whatever reason, you know, he kept with what he was doing and didn't really vary too much from the formula. So that, you know, early boogies, you know, up until maybe the Mark II C+, I thought those were terrific amps. You know, later on they just became, you know, so feature laden and so complex that you couldn't keep track. You need a driver's license to run one. You know, what pot pulls, there's pull pots on the back, there's, you know, there's just so much going on. And
what do you think of the Klon hype, the Dumble hype that people are charging $200,000, $250,000 for an old Dumble? What's your just personal take on that?
Well, I have a pretty good relationship with the Dumble estate, the people that are managing Howard's assets and taking care of his trademarks and things. And I kind of gained a new level of respect. You know, it was real easy to look at him and say, you know, this guy was a real asshole, you know, making people wait 3 years for an amp and you know, taking amps in for service. There were amps that were there for 10 and 20 years that were returned to customers by the people that took the estate over. And, you know, the way it was explained to me by Drew Berlin, who was a good friend of Howard's and who's spearheading the effort to straighten things out, he said he was so OCD that he'd fix an amp for Santana and he wasn't sure it was good enough, so he'd just kind of sit on it and play it and go, you know, and suddenly a month or two becomes a year or two, becomes a decade or two. And it's easy on the outside looking in and perceiving, man, this guy must have been a real jerk, when in fact he was an artisan. You know, it's like the Mona Lisa or anything like that. You know what? Michelangelo's not painting any more pictures. So Dumble made what he made up to a given point in terms of, you know, his 200, 250 amps, plus a lot of custom one-offs and things like that for special people. But he was, you know, an artisan, so he's not going to be making any more Dumbles anymore because he's gone. Yeah. So listen, you know, my father would say something is only worth what a person's willing to pay for it. And if a John Mayer or a Santana or a Bonamassa thinks $250,000 for an amplifier is justified, And it's, we always think of it here like I'm a carpenter and your amp's my hammer. If that amp is a tool that allows you to get to the next level like a 59 Les Paul Burst might do, here's a guitar that, when I worked for We Buy Guitars on 48th Street, that was a maybe $3,000 guitar. People didn't want them. They were too heavy. And then all of a sudden Eric Clapton starts playing one, and Dickie Betts starts playing one, and now you're looking at a 59 Burst that's $500,000 or more. They only made it a limited amount. They're not going to make any more.
There's a story when transistors became all the rage in the 70s, and tube stuff was considered like,
old technology.
Old tech. There was a studio in San Francisco that dumped a bunch of Fairchilds into the Bay, and now, of course, people are getting $200,000, $300,000 for them, but you couldn't get rid of them. You couldn't give them away.
Oh yeah, no, it's
so
it's
you watch gear go up and down like that.
Oh, it's bizarre. And listen, I'm even seeing it with some of my gear. Early stuff that I built in my house when I first started the business. I mean, the first dozen amps that I made, and there's one over in our showroom. I mean, I literally made the cabinets, and I literally bought pre-made chassis, and I punched and drilled, and I had them labeled. I had a plastic faceplate made for them. I mean, it would take me at that time about a week to get it working and get it tuned and make it that I'm happy with it. And
one amp,
one single amp. Oh. And now there's probably 10 or 12 of them in circulation.
What was the model of that amp?
That was the original ODS.
The original ODS.
And we called it an Overdrive Supreme, sort of in, out of respect to Howard Dumble. He had Overdrive Special. We wanted to try and one-up him and poke him in the ribs and say Overdrive Supreme. Again, it was our evolution of the technology that he'd initially come out with. And it's not that far from, if you took a Fender Bassman and you ran channel 1 into channel 2 internally, and you put them together so you could overdrive channel 2 with channel 1, that's the general concept. I had a laugh when I excitedly told an old friend, the late Dennis Kager from Ampeg, I got this thing, I took the Bassman, I took a channel and I ran it, and he looks at me and he goes, "You think you're the only one who ever did that?" And we laughed about it because that's the basis of the Mesa Boogie. It was the basis of the Dumble. It was the basis of a lot of amps that people said, I just keep piling signal on top of signal and get overload. Years later, I developed the ear and the acumen to tune it because you have to really balance out the level and the EQ. Because there is such a thing as bad distortion as well as good distortion. For musicians and guitar players, there's a certain sonic, there's a pleasing quality, the right kind of harmonic distortion. And sometimes it's even and sometimes it's odd harmonics. But there's also bad distortion that's ratty and it sounds like a broken amp rather than an amp that sings. So, you got to kind of trade things off and tune things to get you to that point. The difference between a Marshall and a Dumble or a Marshall and a Boogie. Both of them have distortion. They're unique. They're pleasing in their own way, but they're not the same.
Except if it's a 62, right? So you had the Bassman, the 62 Bassman, that Marshall cloned to kind of put them on the map. What's your take on that whole thing? Intellectual properties and the birth of Marshall and where they're at now?
Yeah, but what's funny though is, Marshall, and you go back a step, you go to Fender and Magnatone and all the companies in the 40s and 50s. At that point in time, and I've got the books, I bought old tube manuals, before it became fashionable and you could download them on the internet. RCA used to make a tube manual, which is essentially a catalog. And it was like, hey, use our tubes. Here's a circuit to show you how to use a 12AX7 or a 6L6 or build a power amp or build a preamp.
Labs did the same thing.
Exactly. So people were given this book, the RCA tube manual, which gave them the information that they needed to take the tubes RCA wanted to build and sell and use them. So, it's like, let me tell you how to use this product that I'm making. And guys like Leo Fender, they started with the tube manual. Hey, I need a guitar preamp. Well, here's a mic preamp that RCA gave me and said, just make sure you put inside the unit that you all credit to RCA or Western Electric or whomever. Give credit where credit is due, but run with the ball. Took a mic preamp, equalized it to get along with guitar, and took that to the next level and made it into a guitar circuit. And Marshall's no different. Marshall made Marshall because apparently at the time importing Fenders into the UK were pricey. They had to pay taxes and the shipping and the import duties and availability of the tubes that we use here as opposed to the tubes they use there. So that's how it became EL34s. That's how it became, obviously 220 volts. They use different types of transformers. Early 100-watt Marshalls used two 50-watt transformers together to make 100 watts, because at the time you couldn't get a 100-watt transformer.